Um, oh, have I just dropped off and come back?
No, sorry, Laura. I realised that neither of us actually did start recording it. So I was trying to do it on the slide. So I've started now. Carry on.
That's
Sorry to
okay. I
interrupt.
thought I might have frozen and come back, so that's okay. At least everyone could hear me. That's all right. Yes, so you will be able to catch up on that talk if you missed it. It will be on our Zoom. But essentially, an invasive species is any species that causes a disturbance or a negative change in a new environment where it's not normally found. So we're looking at species that have entered a new environment and are doing damage effectively. So some of the ones that have been recorded so far on our BioBlitz are wireweed. So this was introduced with oyster spat originally. It's sometimes called Japanese wireweed. It has a very fast growth rate, a very high reproductive rate, and spreads very rapidly. So it can spread about 30 kilometres every year along the coast, and it makes these floating mats on the surface that you might see in the rock pools. We've had slipper limpets recorded, so called because they look a bit like slippers when you turn them upside down. They form stacks together, and they do outcompete with our native species. We've had Darwin's barnacles, sometimes also called New Zealand barnacles or modest barnacles, beaked barnacles, all the different common names you can imagine, which is usually in Australasia, but it came to Britain about 1950, just before. By that point, it was already very widespread, so it already established here. And again, it competes with our native barnacles. And a lot of you probably be familiar with Pacific oysters. So these were intentionally introduced for farming purposes, for food. And since the introduction has just gone quite wild, and again out competing our native oysters and threatening a lot of our marine protected areas. So thanks to you guys who have recorded those. Great records so far. Please keep looking out for invasive species as you're recording. So tonight, what I want to sort of think about is kind of looking at it from the other perspective. So obviously, we have lots of species that are coming here and invading, our native ecosystems. But we're going to think about what happens when our species go elsewhere and the problems that they can cause when they sort of reach new locations. So just to sort of start us off, I've got a couple of examples, quite famous examples of our species that are native to us here in Britain or in Europe. Which have caused a lot of trouble elsewhere where they've arrived. So gorse is one of those. Gorse forms, as I think a lot of you are probably aware, being interested in the coast, forms very thick, dense thickets, and this can outcompete native species in the areas where it's been introduced. This has been introduced into loads of other regions in the world. It also reduces soil quality, so it's not great once it gets going. Periwinkles, this is partially intentional introductions to new locations for food, but also through ballast water and accidental introductions like that through shipping. They graze algae very heavily and they compete with native snails. In North America, this is a particular problem. Mainly got in there in the 19th century and very quickly established and spread. And common cordgrass is another one of our native coastal plants, which actually is mainly been intentional introduction to other places. So it's very well renowned for its ability to help with land reclamation because it stabilizes the land with its roots. So it has been introduced intentionally, but then very quickly spreads, again, outcompetes native plants and changes the food chain. So it alters pollinator activity, which then alters the species that would feed on the pollinators and so on and so forth. So there's a few different methods here of how species have reached new locations from Britain or from Europe. And so I just want to sort of touch on how that happens. So we call these methods vectors, so the way that the species spread to new locations. And for marine species, this is commonly linked to shipping. Commercial shipping is the single largest reason why aquatic invasive species reach new locations. One of these is ballast water. So you may be familiar that cargo ships will take on ballast water in one port and then they'll use that to stabilize themselves as they move to another port where they'll discharge the water, and that releases a massive amount of species. I think it's something like 7,000 aquatic species transported in ballast water every single hour of every single day. So it's a massive impact. And for a long time, it's gone quite unchecked. So this is sort of one of the main things that sort of introduces species. Hull fouling is another one, where it's literally just species hitchhiking on the base of ships. So commercial fisheries and shipping is a really big thing. Some recreational boats and things can also introduce species to new areas. So you might be familiar with being sort of encouraged to clean and check your gear if you have anything to do with fisheries, or when you're kayaking, if you're going away with your kayak. But this is obviously a slightly smaller scale than the sort of the shipping route. Agriculture is another big one. So I mentioned with wireweed that's come partially from the oyster trade. So when you bring in seed oysters or seed mussels, so very young new stocks to start up aquaculture in new areas, you might be bringing in unintentionally hitchhikers. That's very common. Additionally, with things like the ornamental aquaculture trade, so things like the marine sort of aquaria trade, that can also introduce new species. Climate change, as I don't think that will surprise anybody, is expanding the habitats where species can live. Some of that is more range expansion than it is invasion, but the changing climate can also change the movement of ocean currents, and that can mean that where species have got pelagic larvae, they can be carried to new areas where they wouldn't otherwise have reached had that climate change not altered those ocean currents and those conditions. So it can facilitate, quite drastic sort of spreads to new areas. And then the final one is intentional introduction. So as with a couple of the ones that I mentioned, sometimes people intentionally put things into new areas for use as food or for ornamental things. Again, with the marine ornamental trade, sometimes species will get released intentionally by people who can't keep them anymore. So yeah, that's a big one for it as well. So on to our main topic for tonight. This is the European green crab. I'm sure the majority of the people on this call will be very familiar with this crab, but perhaps more familiar with it being called the common shore crab or the shore crab, which is what we tend to call it in the UK. But because it has become so well established elsewhere, green crab is its normal moniker elsewhere. It is one of the worst 100 invasive species in the world. So although perfectly native to us and welcome here, it does cause a huge problem elsewhere. So I want to talk a little bit about its basic ecology, its life history, and then about its impacts as an invasive species, and the potential management efforts that we can do to try and reduce its impact. I do have a lot that I could say on this species. As I said, I've worked with it for about 6 years, and I found it quite hard to put everything into a 1 hour presentation. So if anyone wants to talk more green crab after this, then you'll just have to give me a message, and we can chat anytime. So green crab can live for about 5 to 7 years. They are predated on by a whole host of different things, so that can really vary depending on how they get on. They grow by molting, the same as any other crab, which decreases as the crabs age. And at some point, they'll reach a terminal molt where they will just stop molting. That limit will be reached, and the crab will be fully grown. And at that point, you might see keel worms or barnacles on the surface. It's pretty widespread across UK coastlines, commonly found on rocky shores and in estuaries. And it has a functional role as a predator. It's a grazer and a scavenger as well. Forms a really vital part of rocky shore ecosystems, both up and down. As I said, it's predated upon by all sorts of fish and birds, other crab species. And you can recognise it by its 5 pointed teeth on either side of the carapace. The carapace is wider than it is long. And then it has 3 lobes between the eyes, sort of gentle bumps. And it can grow up to about 10 centimetres for males. Females be slightly smaller, maybe about 7.5 centimetres, and lives anywhere intertidally, subtidally, up to 60 metres. It's got a huge range there of habitats that it can be found in. So a little bit more about its diet. So it's really a complete omnivore. It's green crab are generalists. They can basically survive off of anything. They can be an opportunistic predator. They'll eat mollusks, polychaete worms, other crustaceans. They'll cannibalize each other. And they'll also graze sort of consistently on algae. So you'll find, red and brown algae in the stomachs of crabs. This is something that I've done a little bit of research on myself in terms of examining those stomach contents and what the crabs are eating locally to us. And yeah, it turns out that they're eating a huge range of algae pretty consistently, but that diet would vary seasonally, depending on what habitat that they're in at the time. But they can really just take advantage of pretty much any food source that's around them. As I said, they'll also scavenge opportunistically from anything that they can find. Something else that affects the diet slightly is the difference between the sexes. So crabs, green crab, as with most other crabs, have a crusher claw and a cutter claw. So for green crab, you'll usually find that the right hand claw is slightly larger than the left hand claw. Crusher claw is, as the name sort of suggests, is how much force the crab can use to crush things like periwinkles or other mollusks that it might want to crush and to eat. And so the size of that claw determines the sort of force that they can exert on that. We do find that that varies among the sexes. So the graph on the right there, you'll see is claw size with carapace width. So as the carapace width, the size of the crab increases, the claw size for both sexes is increasing. But for males, which is the blue line, you can see it's a much sharper increase with overall sort of higher sizes for both than it is for the females. The females have a much sort of slower, lower gradient there. And that might not be surprising because, as you might imagine, the males do compete for females. So it's important that they have those sort of larger claws that they can sort of compete with each other with. But what's interesting is we also find that that varies among populations. So in some invasive populations of green crab, you have crabs that have generally larger claw sizes, which is indicative of them adapting quite quickly to be able to eat the food source in that area. So if they can exert more force, then they can access maybe the larger clams or things with thicker shells. So it's an interesting way that crabs can adapt quite quickly to meet the requirements or the resources of their new locations. In terms of habitat, the crabs generally the key thing is that they're looking for shelter, for refuge. So crabs prefer what we call a complex habitat, which literally just means that there's more refuge opportunities, there's more going on, there's lots of coverage for them. There might be different types of refuge in terms of things like seaweed coverage, but really they're found on all types of shores. They're found on rocky shores, estuaries, harbours, anything that's quite sheltered. They don't like a huge amount of wave action there. You can also find them in salt marshes. And one of the reasons for this is because they have a huge tolerance for different temperatures and salinities. So we use the terms euryhaline, which means that they can withstand a big range of salinities, and eurythermal, which means they can withstand a big range of temperatures. For adult crabs, it's something like between 0 and 35 degrees. They can thrive in those temperatures. They prefer to be between the sort of 13 to 22 range, but they can survive under those. And again, they can rapidly adapt in new locations to be able to take advantage of different temperature regimes. So we have invasive populations which are adapted to be in cooler environments and to thrive in those, and other ones which are adapted to be in warm environments, and those are slightly genetically different if you test them. They also pay attention to sediment characteristics, or that can be a determinant of where they live. So finer sediments, crabs like to bury, they like to be covered, they like to seek refuge. So in sort of silty, soft substrate, things like estuaries, muddy estuaries, they do really well. So the plot here is just from a little survey that I did a couple of years ago, where I looked at how many crabs effectively there were of different species in different environments. So I was trying to look at where green crabs like to be. If you see the green coloured sections of the bars, that's the green crab. The other sections are our other native crabs. And you can see that in estuaries, I only found green crab. I didn't find any other species of crab there. And I found higher numbers of green crab there than I did in either eelgrass beds or rocky shores. So certainly locally here in Cornwall, that's where the crabs are preferring to be. It might be that it's an advantage having no other crab species in those estuaries, that they can just take advantage of the resources and not have to worry about competition between crabs. Or it might be that they are the only crabs that have the suitable adaptation to be able to live there, because obviously there's lower salinities there. The temperatures might be slightly higher because it's more protected, sort of more shallow and exposed to UV radiation. So yeah, that's in Cornwall where crabs like to be. But yeah, really you find them all over. One of the most interesting things about green crabs is that they can, as juveniles, change colour. So up to about 30 millimeters, the crabs have this ability to literally change their colour and their pattern to match their background. So if you were to put a crab on a new background within about 30 to 90 minutes, there would be a measurable change in the lightness of the crab to match that background better. But the real sort of dramatic changes happen when the crabs molt. So for juvenile crabs, within about a month, that crab will have molted. And it can go from anywhere towards one of these darker forms on the picture here to being completely white. It can be really dramatic. Next time you find a juvenile crab on the rocky shore, I'd recommend try and take a look at where you found it and what it looks like, and you'll be able to see this in real time. The different patterns help them to match against the background, so it helps them to sort of break up their outline. So if you're a predator looking down on that crab, you'll find it much harder to see the shape of the crab there because you've got these different patterns going on. There's a couple of crabs in the image that have got some quite striking patterns there. And what they can do is they can choose the right background for them. So if you take a crab from the background that it's well matched to and you offer it a choice between that background and a background that's also natural but it's less well matched to, it will choose the background that matches it well. And the way they do this is that they have a special cell called chromatophores in their carapace. So when they're young, the carapace is quite thin, and the chromatophores can essentially release pigment, and that can change their hue and their coloration very quickly. That ability, if you put any kind of stress on the crab, that ability is worsened. So things like um, increasing the temperature or adding a noise in there. This is something that I have studied myself for my master's, spent a long time sort of investigating the effects of a combination of what we call stresses, which is these things that change the environment for the crab. And that means that they're not able to camouflage so well and means that they're then susceptible to being predated on. So it's a really important ability. It's something that really helps them when they arrive in a new location as an invasive species. It's something that can help them to avoid being predated at that juvenile stage when they are just really tasty and attractive to pretty much anything that would come across them. It can help them sort of persist in those new locations. When they get a bit older, they lose the ability to do that. So the carapace thickens, and they no longer can express those chromatophores. But you might have noticed with adult crabs that you do get these different colours of them. So the top of them will be this sort of uniform green colour, which is why they get their name green crab. But underneath, if you turn them over, you'll find there'll be some that would be more red or orange and some that are bright green. And the main sort of reason for this is that it's the length of time since they last molted. So over time, those pigments from the green morph or the green coloration slowly break down and they become this kind of red color. And that has impacts on their tolerances. So where I've said that they're very tolerant of different temperatures and different salinities and sort of poorer environments, as they go to this red coloration, they're less tolerant of all of that. So it changes where you'll find populations of different colours of crabs. And again, it is affected by sex. So, for example, a female red crab would be better able to survive up an estuary where there's lower salinity than a male red crab would be. We don't really know why that is, but generally, green crabs of both sexes would be much better able to survive in those lower salinities and those higher temperatures. Generally, once they molt, the red will go back to green. Sometimes that doesn't happen. So for some female crabs, they've been known to stay red after they've molted. Again, we don't know why this happens. It's a very strange phenomenon. If it's just the pigments breaking down, you'd expect them to be refreshed and green when they molt. But the females will only mate when they're freshly molted. So if you have seasonally high amount of red females, you're coming into the breeding season, she'll then molt, and while she's soft, the male will carry her around and keep her safe because they're very vulnerable whilst they're soft like that. And then yeah, she should turn back to green after that. But as I said, sometimes that doesn't happen. So just to touch a little bit more on the reproduction. So as I said before, up to about 30 millimeters, that's when they become reproductively mature. And from that point, they can every reproductive event have anywhere between a couple of thousand to a couple of 100,000 eggs. So you can imagine when they're in invasive populations how quickly they can and effectively they can spread and reproduce. So when they release their eggs, the larvae are planktonic, which just means that they float freely in ocean currents, and they can be dispersed to new locations where they'll settle. So wherever that current's going, they'll be carried on that and settle in a new location. So again, it means that once they are somewhere and they are reproducing, they spread very quickly, and can move along that coastline. Um, so given all of that and everything you've just learned about green crabs, I'm sure you can start to see why it is that they're such an effective invasive species and they can persist so well in new locations. So, as I said, they are one of the worst 100 invasive species in the world. We'll get onto their sort of specific impacts in a minute. But here on the map, you can see the native range, which is here in Europe, a little bit of North Africa, and then since they've started to spread, they've established in almost every continent. So the earliest and definitely the most sort of well-studied populations are in North America, on the East Coast. That's as early as 1817 that crabs were introduced there. And then since then, they've also been established in Australia, Argentina, Asia, South Africa, pretty much everywhere you can imagine. This has been in three pretty distinct big dispersal waves, which has been driven by increases in global shipping activity. So ballast water is a big thing here, whole fouling, and also aquaculture, again with the seed mussels being brought in, or young sprat. So it's very much sort of a human-driven dispersal, which is why you can see there's these very sort of isolated dispersal patterns there. Otherwise, we might have expected it to be more like a range expansion where the red populations would be much closer to that green kind of area there. When they do get to a new location, they've been known to cause huge ecological damage. So interactions between green crab and native species can be really, really devastating. You can get massive declines in invertebrate species through direct predation. So they eat clams, they eat mussels, juvenile lobsters, they'll eat other crabs. They'll also be competing with native species. In California, I think within 3 years of green crab being first recorded, native populations of shellfish and other crabs had absolutely tanked, they'd crashed. So it can happen very quickly, they can establish quite quickly. And then they can also cause behavioural changes in those species. So if those species start to need to avoid being predated, they'll very quickly sort of change their behaviour, again, with direct competition. So it can cause huge sort of knock-on effects for that ecosystem that they've come into. They can also bring new parasites, new pathogens, diseases when they come in. Those native species might not be able to withstand that. They'll have no resistance to them. So that can, again, very quickly devastate native populations of species, whereas the green crab might have already built up some resistance to those, and again, be an advantage over the native species. And they've also been known to hybridize with native species as well. So a big example of that is a crab called Carcinus estuari, which is in the Mediterranean. It gives the green crab or the hybridized crabs a real advantage because they're reproducing with species that are well established in that area. So the species are able to tolerate all the conditions. They're in, exactly as they should be to be able to be living there. Helps them to reproduce quickly. But obviously it fundamentally changes what's going on in that ecosystem. So it can have a big, again, knock-on effect going forward. The main impact that we sort of tend to hear about is economical impacts. As you might imagine, this is what gets people's attention. This is what brings green crab into the sort of mainstream awareness. It's why it's one of the worst 100 invasive species. They have enormous impacts on the economy. I think the figure there of up to 24 million almost dollars annually is only on the east coast of the US. That's the damage caused by green crabs directly there. Hundreds of jobs are lost per year because basically the clam fisheries and aquaculture crash. So there's various businesses that have crashed there, and people who would normally be involved in those businesses at whatever level lose their jobs. I think it's about 400 jobs a year that they say are lost to the green crab in that area. And yeah, they're eating, directly eating clams, oysters, mussels, and this is been going on for a long time, particularly for East Coast US. It's so those populations have been established for a couple of hundred years now. There's no end in sight, and yeah, huge economic damage, and it's quite difficult to know what to do with that. It's very difficult to sort of overcome that and move forward when those crabs are still a problem. One of the other impacts that is sort of it's the big three for ecologists especially is the impacts on ecologically valuable seagrass beds. So green crab love seagrass as a place to live. As I mentioned before, they're looking for complex habitats. So seagrass offers a lot of refuge opportunities. They can hide very well in all of the fronds. And also it's where a lot of their prey that they like to eat live. So there'll be buried clams. They'll try to dig these clams up. And by doing that, they will dig up the seagrass shoots, especially young shoots. They can effectively clear swathes of seagrass beds. And they're also credited with sort of stirring up that sediment. So it's called bioturbation, and it means that if the sediment is more cloudy above the seagrass, then the photosynthesis will reduce. This is possibly slightly oversold, I think. I would have thought, unless you had huge swathes of green crabs, that that stirring up shouldn't be too much. But as you can imagine, if they're digging in very soft sediments, it does stir some up. So it's potentially another impact that they have. And they do feed directly on the young plants and seeds. So particularly for seagrass restoration efforts, this is a big problem. Obviously, you've got people, scientists, researchers going out and planting young seagrass shoots or putting seeds down, and the green crabs coming along and just hoovering them all up. The Hessian bag that you see there is one of the methods to try and avoid that. So the idea is that seagrass seeds or young shoots are dropped in bags down onto the site where they're trying to restore the seagrass. And as the Hessian bag would break down, by the point that the shoot would be exposed, it would be at a point where hopefully the crabs wouldn't be so much of a threat to it. So it gives the seed a sort of a chance to get going, whilst hopefully the green crabs can't get into them. I don't know that we have much long-term data on how well those are working yet, but it's definitely something that's used. It's used in the UK as well, interestingly. But yeah, it's again a difficult one to sort of tackle. We do have green crab in seagrass beds here in the UK, and don't tend to have sort of those impacts, which is something that's interesting to think about, whether it's to do with there being more green crab, higher population densities, more of them all together in seagrass beds in their invasive locations. I don't know. So just to caveat or slightly confuse everything that I just said. So although I've just listed some really big bad impacts of a big bad invader, they don't always have a negative impact. There's lots of populations where green crab is non-native, but they're not damaging the ecosystem. So when you're considering the impact of any invasive species, you should be looking at a combination of the range, so where the species is, the abundance, how many of them there are there, and then the per capita effect, which is literally the effect per individual of that population. And all of those things combined give you your impact that you're looking at. And there's loads of reasons why that might change from place to place. So there's lots of places where green crab has no impact or very little registered impact. And it could be things like what resources are available into the community where it arrives, how connected that community is, what kind of native predators there are there, what kind of native diseases there are, parasites. Could be how quickly the native species can adapt to having the green crab around, how quickly they can, learn not to be predated or learn to predate on the green crab. Things like climate change or other disturbance or human use of the area. So there's all sorts of reasons why that can vary. But we do know that green crab has had pretty terrible impacts in some places. But yeah, just not in others. So what can we do when they get there? Essentially, the best thing is to stop them from getting there in the first place. I don't know if any of you are water users or have encountered these kind of signs. Particularly the check, clean, dry is very common if you kayak or if you use watercraft or any kind of fishing gear, recreational fishing gear. It's encouraged to try and to check that gear. We can try to do things. This is on a very small scale, but on a larger scale, we can treat ballast water now. So this is something that can happen. So that ballast water can be treated before it's released, so that it's not just releasing species willy-nilly into the environment. Anti-fouling paint is a big one, but that's something that, so essentially you coat the whole of the boat with a toxic paint to try and stop things from hitchhiking on it. But essentially that causes more problems than it solves, in that it's incredibly, well, has been incredibly toxic, and has caused, huge damage to marine life. So that's something that perhaps hasn't worked so well so far in the past, with particular types of anti-fouling paint. Um, there's other things that can be done by sort of individual aquaculturists. So particularly with mussel and oyster farms, in areas where there is invasive green crab, the fishermen are encouraged to check regularly their gear. So literally just to pull up the ropes, check them, and to physically remove any juveniles that are there to try and get it at that early stage. But really, it's quite a difficult thing to have, to try and stop things from coming in. As I said, most of it's coming from global shipping, and that's incredibly hard to effectively stop. But there are things that can reduce the sort of risk. If they do get there, one of the most common ways to try and tackle them is with manual removal. So this is something that happens all over the place where green crabs are invasive. It's large scale trapping by scientists, researchers, people who are trained. Obviously, this is incredibly labor intensive. It's very expensive to do, and the idea of this is not to completely remove the population. You're not going to be able to completely remove that population. It's already there. The larvae are, as I said, are pelagic. Um, you're literally just sort of doing a very small scale thing through this, even if it is technically a large scale trapping. You're only sort of getting a little bit of it. But the plan with it is to try and reduce the population to such a level where either the impacts are reduced to the point where it's bearable, or where that population might reach a state where it can't continue to persist, like to keep going. So, for example, the traps will attract more male crabs than they will female crabs. So you might reach a state where you've removed the majority of male crabs from that population, and therefore the females that are left is not enough to be doing, large scale breeding. Eventually, the population might die out, or it'll just reduce to such a level where it's not, not a problem. So this can be effective to reduce those impacts, but as I said, it's not an option to sort of completely remove all the crabs. So you can combine that with good prediction and early detection. So one of the most common things is this sort of community monitoring. You'll find, again, across sort of all of the areas where green crab is invasive, they have some various sort of community scheme, either citizen science based or encouraging people to remove the crabs and how to safely do that and report them. You can also, in areas where you don't have a high population, lots of people who could do that, or you don't have people who are trained to do that, you can combine that with detection methods like eDNA. So eDNA is environmental DNA. And essentially all you do is you look in the seawater for the DNA of a creature that you're interested in. So we can know whether there's green crab generally in the area. We can't know how many crabs there are or what that kind of population looks like in terms of whether they're juveniles or adults, or exactly where they are. So you would still need to trap to know where exactly they were, but you can get an idea of whether they're present, particularly for remote areas. This is quite important, or areas where they haven't reached yet, or we think they haven't reached yet. And then the other thing we can do is modelling. So scientists can try and predict where the green crab are going to be and what the impacts are based on what we know already about where they are and the environments that they're in and the impacts that they're having. So those combined can help, along with the trapping. We can help to know what habitat's going to be at risk next, and where we might need to intervene. And then an interesting management strategy that quite often comes up for invasive species is biological controls. So this is where you release a natural enemy of the invasive species. It always puts me in mind of the old lady who swallowed a fly and then swallowed a spider and then a bird and so on, because it's sort of a bit like you're replacing your current big bad with the next big bad that's going to, take care of that. But what's that big bad going to do, to the population? So it's very risky. Timing is key. There are some examples of where it's gone well and some examples of where it's not gone so well. So successful examples are quite common in particularly sort of gardening kind of spheres. So using things like parasitic wasps to control white fly in greenhouses. Some of you might be familiar with using nematodes to control box moth caterpillars. Those, can work, don't seem to have particular knock-on effects. So there are successful examples, particularly if you get the timing right. But there's some very, very famous bad examples where things have gone catastrophically wrong. So in about 1935, about 100 cane toads were released into Queensland to try and control beetle pests on sugarcane crops. And now there are about 200 million cane toads, and they are basically killing off a lot of the local wildlife because anything that eats them, cane toads are toxic. So lots of local snakes and lizards and other animals are dying. There's some really interesting research going on to try and reduce the amount that those native wildlife are eating the cane toad. So can talk about that some other time, but because I think I'll run out of time tonight. But some really interesting things to try and make them associate cane toads with being ill. So sort of microdosing these native wildlife, which is a pretty cool idea. But yeah, it's a disastrous example of a biological control. As are mongoose, which were introduced again to protect sugarcane or sugar plantations to Hawaii. They were brought in to try and kill rats. But what the people didn't realise was that rats are mainly nocturnal, whereas mongoose hunt during the day. So they didn't kill any of the rats, but they did kill a lot of the ground nesting birds by eating all the eggs. So again, pretty disastrous and just not too well thought out. So one of the options for the green crab that's been discussed is using the crabhacker barnacle as a biological control method in invasive populations. This has been quite quickly sort of refused. I don't think this will happen, and I think it's probably a good idea. For anyone who's not familiar with the crabhacker barnacle, if you've ever picked up a green crab and thought, oh, she's got eggs underneath, and then realised, oh, maybe this looks a little bit too solid or a bit too yellowy to be eggs, it must be something else. That's the crabhacker barnacle. So essentially, this is a very strange little parasitic barnacle that, when it settles, rather than settling on the rock, like most barnacles do, it will settle onto a green crab and inject itself inside the green crab, slowly take over the green crab's functioning, and basically use the green crab to grow itself inside. It changes the green crab's behaviour, and eventually the green crab will release the young larvae of the barnacle, and then will die. So if you ever find a green crab that's a bit lethargic, they're not able to molt, so they'll have things like more keel worms or barnacles on them. They're likely to be infected with the crabhacker barnacle. The problem with it is that it's not particularly specific with what it targets, so it does target other crabs. So if you were to introduce that into an invasive population, it's likely you're going to end up with a lot of native crabs being infected as well. So for that reason, it's not a viable biological control. There has been suggestion of using other parasites. There's some nematodes and tapeworms, larval tapeworms, that could be an option, but so far has not been uptaken. One of my favourites is to eat the problem. I love this idea. I like the idea of bringing people on board and increasing public awareness. There's some great work going on again in the east coast of the US in terms of trying to get people to engage with the removal of green crab by making them palatable. Obviously, you've got massive trapping efforts going on. You know, what's the point of wasting that if it could be a functional food source for people? Green crab is perfectly fine to eat, but it's very low yield. They're very small crabs. It's not ideal, so you need to be a bit creative when you come up with recipes. There's a whole site called greencrab.org, which has made all these really cool recipes. There's a couple of cookbooks out. It's a great way to engage the public and increase public awareness. And yeah, just try to change attitudes around them. I think it's something similar that's been done with lionfish as well, in terms of eating lionfish where they're very invasive. Great idea. I don't know how well it's going, but they're giving it a go, as is drinking the problem. So the other thing you can do is to make whiskey out of green crab, which is being done, believe it or not, in New Hampshire. So this actually won, I think, Drinks Innovator of the Year a couple of years ago. So it's been recognised, but I don't know how well it's doing commercially or quite what that would taste like. I would love to try some, but I haven't been able to get my hands on any yet. So, but yeah, I think just examples of ways that you can engage people with the problem and just try and sort of make use of what's there. The final sort of, not really a management strategy, but something that you can sort of do in this case is just to do nothing. So there's been loads of examples of invasive populations of even very successful or well-known invasive species that completely crash out and die out with no intervention at all. So you have this term boom bust dynamics. This is quite common generally in ecology, but for invasive populations, what we see quite often is this obviously quite often you get this slow introduction and then usually the peak just sort of keeps on going and levels off, and sometimes rather than doing that, when the population starts to rise, it will reach a peak level, or it might go along at that peak for a little while and then suddenly it will crash, and we don't always know why that happens. This can make this really difficult to predict, or to use in any way, because most of the populations that have crashed this way, we can't work out why that is. It might be a combination of things. It could be to do with disease or delayed genetic effects, habitat change, but it happens some 10 or 20 years after the population's established. So it's not just a quick flash in the pan. It has happened with wireweed in a population in Spain. So I think it was about 20 or maybe even 25 years after the population was established, just crashed, completely disappeared, and then we don't know why. So it does happen. It's a very risky strategy if you were to think, oh, well, this species quite often crashes, so we'll just let it be and see if that happens. So it's not really a viable option if you've got the economic ability to be able to intervene if you need to. But it is an interesting phenomenon that seems to happen. It's something that I have had personally experience of with the green crab. So I went to Tasmania to study the invasive populations of green crab there that had been established since about 1990. And when I got there, there weren't any there. So I don't know why that happened. It's as yet unpublished work. I'll be interested to see if anyone in the future goes and works out why that happened. But it's something that could potentially happen with invasive populations of green crab in some areas, depending on the conditions in those areas. So hopefully I'm doing okay for time. There's one more slide that I just want to touch on, as we've got time. Here in the UK, recently there's been some chatter about whether, particularly in the south and the southwest, green crab might not be doing so well. So people have been starting to say, "Oh, I used to find green crab all the time, but now I only find Montague's crabs or the xantho crabs. Oh, I think green crabs are, I only see the babies, I don't see the adults anymore." And so this is something that's been brought up a lot. It's something that I've looked into myself again, yet to sort of um, publish that. And it's very difficult to try and work out what's just anecdotal reports and where the data actually is, because we don't tend to have much abundance data. A lot of our records are just presence records. Obviously, things that we submit to INAT as part of our Big Report Challenge, those are presence records. So it's quite difficult to know what's actually happened, if anything. But if anybody here, particularly from elsewhere in the UK, outside of the South and Southwest, has noticed anything with your crab populations, then please do give me a message or have a chat to me about it, because I'd be very interested to know. It's always, interesting to gain those insights from people who have known, those areas for a long time, know those populations and see changes. It's very interesting to think of this green crab that's so resilient and doing so well so many places in the world, perhaps not doing so well in the place where it's native, and why that might be. But yeah, that's everything from me. I've left about 10 minutes for questions, which is my plan. I think I've done quite well on the time. I'm quite pleased. But I just want to say before I stop chatting, thank you very much for listening. If you do want to reach out to me directly or to connect with me, you can do that on LinkedIn. You can send me an email. As I said, you can email the main Rockpool Project email address. But please do join the National BioBlitz if you haven't already. There's a QR code there that takes you straight to our app where you can sign up. And you can see there our fabulous prize that's on offer. So we've got t-shirts for every region, and we've also got hoodies, a hoodie, sorry, a one of a kind hoodie available for the overall winner. So you'll be the only person who has that hoodie if you win. So yeah, head to our app, get signed up, get recording, and find some invasive species. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions, then please do shout out or put them in the chat, whatever you fancy.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think a round of applause is in order, whether a real one or a virtual one. If you can send it via your Zoom button, I found out how to do it myself. Well, yeah, that was really interesting and brilliant to be able to get that perspective of one of our species going elsewhere in the world at a time when we're looking at what's come from elsewhere in the world to here. So. Thanks very much for that. If anyone's got any questions for Laura, please do put them into the chat. But I might start us off if that's okay, Laura.
Please do, absolutely.
I was looking at the map of the global map of where it's gone. Um, And it hasn't reached New Zealand. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, to
Now,
my
is
knowledge, there's none there.
any idea why not? Because I mean, obviously they're quite hot on invasive species. So have they actually managed to prevent it arriving, or is it was it not going there anyway?
They are very hot on their invasive species. I imagine it's a combination of things, to be honest. I think partially, I would imagine there's less really large scale global shipping going on there. I would have thought in terms of actual, huge cargo ships. That might be wrong, but compared to somewhere, you know, well, like with these the sort of huge ports like Victoria or anything like that, I think perhaps there's less traffic. But yes, they are much hotter on their biosecurity. I don't know what their policy is on things like ballast water or how they manage that, but I wouldn't be surprised because they do have, I think, the best biosecurity protocols of any country. Really, they're definitely more aware of things. So, but yes, to my knowledge, there's none there. It might also be they would have to be directly introduced there. I don't think there's any particular chance of them getting there through nearby populations coming across with larval transport because it is just it's too remote, I think, for them. Whereas when you take Tasmania, they weren't introduced to Tasmania; they've come across the strait from the mainland, so because they can get across that gap. So yeah, it might be a combination of those things. But to my knowledge, they're not there.
But
Yeah.
would I be right in thinking that it's probably quite a good environment from there? That it's not environmental
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah.
I think it would be. I think it would be quite similar to what we have here in terms of climate. I would have thought. Yeah, I mean that again was the thing with Tasmania is it's incredibly similar climate wise and habitat wise to what we have here. So it's quite surprising that the crabs had died out. So
Cool. Well, thank you for that. So we've had a couple of comments on the chat. Please do keep them coming, folks. Fiona Boyd has reported there's definitely less crabs in Bude than a few years ago. I don't know if you're available to elaborate on that at all, Fiona. If so, please feel
Sorry,
free to unmute.
sorry.
Hi,
Hi,
Fiona.
yeah.
How you doing, Fiona?
I'm okay, thanks. Um, yeah, we used to see quite a lot of them, like loads of them tucked in the honeycomb reefs and lots of juvenile ones, but haven't seen that many at all. Um, a few little teeny tiny ones and like the odd ones, so they are still around, but definitely not to the same extent that they were. I think last year was quite low numbers as well, but like maybe 2 years ago, there were definitely still quite a lot. I don't know why that would
that's quite a quick.
be.
Yeah, that's quite a
Yeah,
quick change as well, isn't it? I think most of the sort of comments we've had on it have been within the sort of last 10 years or so. But yeah, I do get the impression that something is changing, and perhaps it could be that they're just changing their habitat use, that the adults are
yeah,
moving subtidally or moving into the estuaries, for whatever reason that might be. It could be they're competing with other species on the rocky shore, and then they're feeling like they're doing better in the estuaries because they don't have to compete with other species. So it could be that. But yeah, that is similar to what I've heard from other people in terms of the sort of there are some juveniles around, but they seem to be less, than they were before.
yeah. Do you think like we have a beach school and we in the summer we take quite a lot of groups rock pooling in the same areas? Do you think that could have an impact on the crab populations? Could we be I mean, we're always quite careful and we ask the children to be gentle and watch where they're standing and not to touch the animals. But, if there's a lot of people walking on the rocks, do you think that could affect them or?
I would be surprised, I think, if your impact was that great. Obviously,
Yeah,
like you said, encouraging people to be gentle and put things back where they found it, and that is really important. And if you were to have hundreds and hundreds of people regularly, trampling, that might have an impact. But I think unless people are removing them, or
yeah,
keeping them in buckets or whatever where they're dying, I would be very surprised. And I'd be surprised if you didn't notice the same thing with other rockpool species that might be more
yeah,
sensitive than
yeah.
green crab, if that was the case. I think, some green crab, they do daily migrations where they'll come from deep water to come and forage, up in the rocky shore and then go back down. So I would have thought at the times that you're in the rock pools, it's probably the times when they're not, because it would be
Yeah.
daytime and it'd be low tide. So it's probably, I wouldn't have thought so. But
Okay.
I think it's definitely good to be aware of our impact when we're doing stuff like that. It's
Yeah.
I don't want to
Thank
be sort
you.
of yeah.
Thanks very much, Fiona.
No problems. Thank you.
Thank you.
Um, so yeah, a very interesting comment from Joan Marie. I'll read it out and then maybe I don't know if Joan Marie's available. I'll read the comment. Using green crab for food also has issues. I live in Washington State, where European green crabs are a problem. We weren't too happy when they were shipped from the East Coast to one of our local food markets for sale. There's also a concern that they would be encouraged to grow rather than being a way to control the problem. Great talk, by the way. Welcome, Joe Marie. Are you actually joining us from the States?
Yes, I am.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, it's good to have you on board. Yeah, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit more and just tell us a bit about how the crabs are sort of impacting your area over there?
Well, it's a big deal in Washington State. I think there's actually a state of emergency declared by
Okay.
our governor last year, and there's a lot of monitoring that's going on. I've been part of the monitoring team for I think it's 8 years now. But they're all over the Puget Sound region is really where we see them. And anyway, it's a good program, and then there's also people doing the removals like Laura was talking about. And I will add to what Laura said about who does those kind of removals. They are trained folks, but also out here, a lot of those areas that are impacted are on tribal lands. So a lot of the tribes are taking the lead on when they do have removal actions. But anyway, yeah, the story about the green, we have in the Seattle area, there's a market that's well known called Pike's Place Market. And they're known for their seafood. And if you've ever seen people throwing salmon, that's kind of the area. And apparently last summer, somebody shipped some European green crab to the market. And it was like, no, we don't need them being shipped in from the East Coast. So anyway, this talk has
Yeah.
been very interesting, and from my perspective, European green crab is the enemy, and it's so funny to hear the discussion about them just being, the regular crab that you see all the
Yeah.
time in the tide pool.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for joining us. But yeah, I would never have imagined them being shipped across like that, particularly when if you were
I
going to
didn't
use them
think
for
so
food, you've
either.
obviously got enough there already.
Yeah,
Um,
anyway, they stopped it immediately, of course, but yeah, pretty funny.
yeah, I'm surprised that the regulations allowed them to
Well,
do that in the first place.
well,
But yeah, that's
yeah,
really interesting.
who knows? But I think it's because on the East Coast there are places that are treating it as food, and there's restaurants that are trying it out and things like that. So I think, from one perspective, it is a food product in some areas.
That's
I'm
so
not the
interesting.
ex
Thank you so much.
I'm not the expert on it. So
No, but I mean, yeah, it's brilliant to have your point of view from someone who's actually experiencing it. Because as you said, for our point of view, we're they're just our normal crabs. So that is really interesting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Joan Marie, and thanks for joining us. I think I've got one more question, so we'll take that one if that's okay, Laura.
Yeah.
So it's a question from Nancy. So Nancy says, "Thank you for this talk. It's been very interesting and informative, especially as I wish to pursue a career in marine biology. Regarding your master's research, where did you focus on the impact of stresses and noise pollution on crab behavior camouflage and molting?" Um, Sorry, there's a little cursor hiding the next word, but I guess I am completing a EPQ extended project qualification in year 12 regarding human impacts on marine life, and I feel this relevant to my secondary research. maybe saying that maybe they can drop you an email. But I don't know if you want to just quickly touch on that, Laura.
Yeah, first of all, please do drop me an email. I'd be very happy to chat. I saw you said about is it public? Yes, there is a paper that I put out on it. So if you do drop me an email, I can share that with you. I won't be able to find it quick enough now. But yeah, I focused on looking at the impacts of a combination of noise pollution and increased temperatures on the camouflage and the anti-predator behavior of the green crab. So I was looking at juvenile green crabs. I had them for a period of time, for a few months, and looked at how well they were able to background match under different conditions of the combination of those stressors and individually, and found that the combination of them, I don't want to get too far into this now, but stressor combinations can be really unpredictable, and the way that those two things work together was not quite what I was expecting. And it also affected how quickly they ran away from a predator effectively. So I was doing, false predation experiments, and seeing how they behaved after, in that stress, and the noise and the higher temperatures basically sort of seemed to confuse that behavior, and they didn't, do that so well. So yeah, I can send you the paper, and you can have a look. And yeah, if you want to talk more over email, your EPU sounds really interesting. It's obviously a very apt and valuable topic to be doing it on. So yeah, if you want to chat, then please do give me an email.
Brilliant. Well, we better wrap it up now. So thank you very much, Laura, and thanks very much everybody else for joining us this evening. It's been a really fascinating talk and brilliant to get everybody together like this. Last shout to get everybody out there. We've still got the slide up there to record during the National Bioblitz. We're focusing on non-native species, but you're more than welcome to record a shore crab and other native species whilst you're at it. We'll be running it until the end of Sunday, so you've got plenty of time to use it as an excuse to get down to the beach and see what you can find. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.